Welcome to our 110th day on the trail. We have 4 readings for today. From the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, Numbers 17, verses 1 through 12, the 100th Psalm, and Judith, chapter 13, verses 12 through 20. Welcome to the Gospel of John. This is the second of the 4 Gospels that we will explore on the trail. Now, before we start with our reading from chapter 1 today, I wanted to give you some context and background to John's Gospel. Traditionally, as the name implies, the Gospel according to John is attributed to John, son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. As early as the 2nd century AD, the church father and bishop of Lyons, Irenaeus, attributed this Gospel to John, the disciple of Jesus, who wrote his Gospel from the city of Ephesus. However, in the Gospel itself, John the son of Zebedee is not specifically mentioned. Instead, throughout the Gospel, the author, who is identified as an authoritative witness to the events contained in the Gospel, refers to himself as one whom Jesus loved. Now, some scholars suggest that while John's eyewitness testimony forms the core of the Gospel, the final version reveals several stages of composition. However, this is not necessarily the case. Instead, the Gospel of John that we read today, nearly 2,000 years after its composition, remains a cohesive witness to the story of Jesus produced by John, the beloved disciple, around AD 80 to 90. The Gospel of John is also very different from the Synoptic Gospels, that is, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also makes use of a very different symbolic universe. Over the years, I have heard ministers and clergy members recommend John as a good starting point for new followers of Jesus. However, I would respectfully disagree with this approach, which is why the trail begins with Luke, a gospel written to Gentiles who had little knowledge of Jewish history, but still contains powerful stories and instructions from Jesus. Starting with Luke provides the new reader with an opportunity to become familiar with the basic stories of Jesus and his teachings before engaging the more challenging symbolic and philosophical world of John's Gospel. In John, we find longer, more complex discussions from Jesus, with numerous references to deeply symbolic and philosophical concepts such as light and truth, seeing and knowing. Dualism is also heavily used in John's Gospel, such as light versus dark, above versus below, true versus false, and life versus death. Now, we will pay special attention to these dualistic pairs as we travel through John's Gospel to help us better understand and appreciate John's approach to the story of Jesus. Now, with that brief introduction, let's open to the first chapter of this amazing and powerful gospel. Also, since we are dealing with more complicated passages, we will be reading more of the text together in this part of the trail, so that the passages are fresh and familiar as we explore them. We begin in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. John does not start his gospel with an angel appearing to Mary or Joseph, or even the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Instead, John goes back to the beginning, quite literally, As John sees it, what is about to happen with the arrival of Jesus started back when God said, "Let there be light," in the book of Genesis. But now, the true light of the world was about to arrive on the earth. As in Genesis chapter 1, John's Christmas story, so to speak, begins with darkness. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we read, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." Into this darkness, God speaks. With the words, "Let there be light," darkness is sent scurrying. Light cannot be stopped, and darkness has no power to overcome it, ever. Light shows things for what they really are. It strips away disguises and concealment. Light reveals the truth, and that truth is then reflected everywhere. This was the light that was coming into the world. And we see this imagery of light and darkness flowing throughout John's Gospel. Later, in John 8, verse 12, Jesus says of himself, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." However, also in chapter 1, John tells us that when Jesus came to what was his own, he was not welcomed. Beginning in verse 10, "He was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him." Jesus was expected, but not embraced. He had been anticipated from the beginning of creation, but when he finally arrived, he was rejected. And why was he dismissed? Well, for many of the same reasons that he is still rejected to this day. Simply, some people prefer the darkness. In John 3, beginning in verse 19, "And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light, and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God." So notice that this reference to the dichotomy between light and darkness is found throughout John's Gospel. Another example, in John's telling of the time when the disciples were caught in a storm on the Sea of Galilee, we find this description. From John chapter 6. "When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. The disciples were distracted by the darkness, not unlike the dark clouds and storms which often roll into our lives. Or consider the moment when Judas betrayed Jesus during Passover. Judas had lived with Jesus and heard him teach. Judas witnessed the light, but still he decided to betray Jesus. So on the night of Jesus' arrest, after Jesus had washed the disciples' feet, he confronts Judas. Notice how John tells this part of the story. In John 13, verse 30. "So, after receiving the piece of bread, he, Judas, immediately went out, and it was night." How dark must that night have been for Judas? But despite the darkness that had engulfed the world, the impossible happened. Let's turn back to John chapter 1, verse 14. "And the Word became flesh and lived among us. We have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. To the Greeks in the first century, God becoming a human was utterly inconceivable. However, this was a central hope of the prophets. In Ezekiel 37, verse 27, it says, "My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." The divine, limitless, sovereign, creative Word of God became Emmanuel, God with us. The Greek term that is translated lived among us carries the idea of staying in a tent and calls back to the time that Israel spent in the wilderness during the Exodus. Like the tabernacle, in which the glory of God dwelled during the Exodus sojourn, Jesus came to the earth and tented with us. And one final point for today. The Word became flesh. This Greek word logos also carries a depth of meaning. The concept of logos, or word, gives body or presence to thought. What we think in our minds is actually hidden. Our thoughts are not part of the external world until those thoughts are given expression in the real world through our words. What was once internal becomes part of reality. As we all know, and perhaps all too well, words are incredibly powerful. In Genesis, for example, God's intentions, His plans, and purpose for creation became real when He speaks them into existence. The Word of God brings forth everything we know in the universe. Likewise, in Jesus, we find the invisible presence and power of God given real, visible expression in the world. The Word of God, which created the universe and everything in it, became flesh and tented with us. In Him was light, the true light, which illuminates the darkness, and there is nothing that the darkness can ever do about it. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.